Well, the AP test is coming, and it is time to review period 5, which is from 1750 to 1900 CE. And so this is what we're going to look at. There are 4 key concepts with period 5, and so we'll go through them pretty rapidly. So hang on as we kind of go along for this. Now, the first one that we're going to talk about is key concept 5.1, which is the idea of industrial revolution and global capitalism. Now, the one thing that I want you to remember when you think of period 5 and you think this time frame, think of the word revolution, because it'll have to do with both industrial revolution as well as the revolutions that are going to occur. And we'll get to that in just a little bit. But the big thing that you need to know about industrialization is really basically this bottom line is how it, one, changed how goods were produced. So while you're looking at that, this almost seems like so stinking obvious, but the reality is they went from making things by hand to now making them by machines. And the way that that changed the world is huge. This would be a great turning point essay on the AP exam. So just make sure that you're paying attention to all the changes also that happen along with this. Also would be a good change in continuity essay. So we will keep talking about all the changes that occur during this. Now, first of all, it's key to know why it started in Great Britain. Now, first of all, Great Britain was doing well at the time, so there she be. And we'll be looking at how she was very commercialized, had a huge empire. Remember, the sun never set on the British Empire, and we'll continue talking about that. Now, they have a lot of agricultural innovations there, which is increasing their productivity, which is freeing up labor on the countryside, that we need people to be productive. And so people are starting to be working in these factories. And then again, as we just said, population growth means more laborers. Also, why did it start in Britain compared to other places? Geography is the main thing that you need to know here. One, just the reality is they have lots of coal, iron, timber in Great Britain. And so that made it very accessible and a great place for this all to start. Also, they have an abundance of rivers and canals, and obviously they are an island. So all those things together, it made it very easy for them to be the country that really started the Industrial Revolution, and it's going to spread to a lot of different places, as we'll see in just a second. But remember, it all starts here. X marks the spot in Great Britain. Now, as we said, development of machines is a huge thing. One we see right here is the idea of the steam engine. We also see the mechanical reaper on the bottom left. Also, the key thing we're thinking about is the assembly line, not just for cars, but in general. The assembly line changes the whole game of the Industrial Revolution. No longer does everyone kind of make something from start to finish, but you do a part of a task, and you do that part over and over and over again. And it allows you to be more efficient and do things quicker. And so we see this idea of mechanization, the idea of using the assembly line, huge change as we talk about that. Also a huge change, which doesn't bode so well for the environment, we start using fossil fuels in ways that we've never used throughout history before. Another reason why it's a turning point. We see the use of coal, we see the use of oil, huge developments as we look at machines becoming the way that we make things. Now, some key other changes, like I said, would be an awesome essay. You guys would knock it out of the park. Would be the idea of the first and the second Industrial Revolution. Now, the first Industrial Revolution comes first, and it is going to be the ones where we move from just hand production to machines, as we've been talking about. The idea of the Watt steam engine is huge here. So we start using steam. The second Industrial Revolution is the key word here, steel, chemicals, electricity. And those are the different things that will happen as time goes on, as technology develops at a quicker pace. But changes that we see from hand production to machines all the way up to steel, electricity, and the world is changing faster than ever. Huge changes. Another change, like I said, this would be a great essay. Changes in transportation and communication. The idea of the canal system being able to move things quickly over water is huge. Railroads are a big deal, okay? Again, you can ship things very quickly along them. With the invention of steel in the second Industrial Revolution, we now have railroads that we are putting together and being able to move things across countries. We know this is especially true if you're from the United States. We see that as well as across Europe. We see the steam engine being used on boats as well. So those are ways that transportation changes, and we'll talk about that a little bit more when we look at migrations and how those two things link together. but also how communication changes. The idea of the telegraph and the telephone. Today it seems so obvious, but again, this is a huge difference and things that are moving along as we go through history that makes life different. Another change, if you will. So, what are the impacts of the Industrial Revolution as we're kind of saying, what does this look like? So, first of all, we're going to have some very huge export industries. So, there are countries around the world, a lot of times, that are being dominated through imperialistic tendencies, like Europeans, but we're going to see them start producing single natural resources. So, we see certain economies, we know this is true in the United States, in the South, that we have cotton being a major one. We know if you're in the Congo, a little off there. In the Congo, they had rubber. We see industries in, not all that area, but in the Caribbean, we're going to see sugar plantations. And so certain economies are going to become very big in exporting this single natural resource. And a lot of times, as we've been looking at from the last period, shipping these things back to Europeans where they're going to finish and use those and then sell them other places. But certain industries, their whole economy is built on essentially a single natural resource. We also see in this area, we're going to try to have the U.S. open up Japan with Matthew Perry in Japan, and then we're also going to see in China the idea of what's going to go on with the Opium Wars with the British. So come back to that a little bit later. Otherwise, in Mexico, we're going to see that they're going to be using copper and finding copper and using that for industrial products. And then in South Africa as well, we're going to see gold and diamond mines being a really big deal. So these export economies, it's also going to really hurt these agricultural-based, making things by hand-based economies. And so they just can't keep up. It's the reality of the times. And so it is going to hurt these other economies. We're also going to see then these industrialized nations really wanting to find new markets to sell their finished products they've made. And so now they're going to be leaving from Europe and selling to Africa, to India, to China. And so we're going to see this expand, obviously, back to the United States at this time. And so big impacts of the Industrial Revolution. Now, obviously, it impacts economics as well. And so there are two key people that if you ever had to kind of really analyze the economics behind this, you want to mention these two people, especially Adam Smith. Adam Smith is laissez-faire capitalism. Capitalism is kind of the name of the game during the Industrial Revolution, and the idea of that you can make money by making these different consumer goods. Now, Adam Smith said, he's a philosopher, and he really came out and basically said, hey, we should really be hands-off the economy. That's the laissez-faire part. So, hands off. That's a really good drawing. Hands off the economy. And that's really good. So, and they don't have four fingers. But either way, hands off the economy, he says. Leave it alone. It's going to self-regulate just like how the tide comes in and out and the sun rises and sets. The economy will regulate itself. The government does not need to be involved. Hands off is what Adam Smith will say. And John Stuart Mill will also come up with this idea of economic liberalism, and we'll also push for other things like utilitarianism, as well as the ideas of really allowing kind of people to live their lives in a very unhindered way by the government. And so there's some economic pieces to this that are pretty crucial for you to realize. And on the flip side, in the exact same way, during the middle of the Industrial Revolution, we have another response, which is from Karl Marx. And it's very opposite of Adam Smith. You could compare and contrast their ideologies in the same way. Karl Marx really had a problem with this whole capitalistic idea because what he saw in the middle of the Industrial Revolution was that these wealthy people that owned the means of production, or the bourgeoisie, the owners of the factory, were basically paying people nothing and making lots of money off of them. And so since there was such an excess number of workers, they could do this. And if you didn't want to work for them, you would get fired. And so Karl Marx came out with the Communist Manifesto as a means to say, hey, the bourgeoisie is oppressing the average person, the worker, the factory worker. And The world is really just this big struggle between the great classes of our time, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. So, when we understand the context of where his ideology came from, it makes a lot of sense in that it was during the Industrial Revolution and the terrible things that were happening to people during this time. So, if we were ever to write anything and you were to talk about the Industrial Revolution, Karl Marx would be a name that you probably want to bring up as a response to the Industrial Revolution. Now, there are also a lot of other responses when we look at the world, and so we're going to kind of go and jump around the globe real quick and hopefully explain these different other responses to the Industrial Revolution. So first, let's start in China. When we're looking at China during this period of time, put a big Qing dynasty in this area. When we are looking at that, that's a Q, not a circle, but the Qing dynasty, we're going to see that they're having different responses to the Industrial Revolution. The Manchus are ruling China at this time, and the British are really having a hard time to sell things to the Chinese. And so what do? They find a way to basically grow opium in India, which is part of their area, and start selling it, those are great drawings, to the Chinese. And so we have this situation where we have the Opium Wars. As the British are trying to be industrialists and imperialists and sell their goods and make more money, capitalism 101, we see that the Chinese are not so happy with this. And so they try to tell them to stop, and they capture a boat and they burn their opium, which makes the British very angry. And so what we see here is that the British, though, are stronger. They're more industrialized. They have better weapons. And so they kind of come in, as I love to say, guns a-blazing up the river, and the Chinese have to agree to some unequal treaties, which makes it really hard. And so now we see that not only is the Industrial Revolution allowing Britain to become stronger and more advanced in technology, it allows them to be imperialists. And we'll talk about that in the next key concept here. But they try to go through this period of time, the self-strengthening movement, to kind of mix the ideas of Confucianism with kind of some modernization, which is not so successful. We see some success at different times. We also see then all these things put together. We have a Boxer Rebellion, kind of a nationalist movement to push out foreigners because of what's going on with this kind of industrialization and imperialism. So all those things fit together, and that's what's going on in China. Then we have Japan. Japan, same situation, almost, only the U.S. are the people that force open the ports here. Matthew Perry, not the guy from Friends, but he comes on in, wants them to open up to trade because they've been very isolationist. We remember from the last period, they only really traded with the Dutch. And so they bring about, because of these changes, kind of some chain reactions that ends the Tokugawa shogunate, and they have this Meiji restoration where they move forward with industry and actually are really successful. Of everybody that tries to industrialize, that first maybe have some Western incursion, we see that they actually come out of this positively and become very strong, which will be really important when we look at period 6 and their imperialistic tendencies. The Ottoman Empire then, X marks the spot for that. The Ottoman Empire, as we're looking into modern-day Turkey, is now known as the sick man of Europe. They've been declining and declining over time. One, they haven't industrialized like the rest of the world. When we look back at last period, people are bypassing them to get to the Indian Ocean as transoceanic trade and being able to kind of make the way through these areas. We see they're not doing so well. And one group that really tries to bring about modernization and tries to talk about industrialization are some of the proponents in the Young Turks. But otherwise, they're really struggling as well. Russia, we see, there she be. Russia, as we kind of talked about the Romanovs in the past and Peter the Great taking on things from Europe, we see that they really have a state-dominated industrialization, state-supported, state-driven, which doesn't make a huge jump later on when we move to communism with state-controlled industry. But at this time, they were the ones that really tried to push them forward once again under the Romanov dynasty, Tsarist Russia, and they focused really on heavy industry. So we're talking like steels and metals. And then Egypt, even at this time, we see that Muhammad Ali, not the boxer, really pushes them forward to kind of gain some control back so they're not under the guise of the Ottoman Empire, and they really work on textiles. So we see the rest of the world, and obviously we know the United States is industrializing as well and is quite successful, along with many other countries within Europe where things spread from Great Britain and into Europe as well. So the Industrial Revolution, highly successful, and it does bring some social changes as well. We see in different areas where we're looking, one, we're going to have different kind of slum areas. People move from kind of the countryside to the city. We have massive urbanization. And so as we're looking at this, we see that people live in close quarters. They're not spread out as they used to be. We see the rise of like apartment complexes. We also see the rise of people having to be concerned with time, when they start, when they finish, which is very different from what we saw before when you lived more in the countryside. And then we see changes in social structures. When we're looking at kind of how society is organized, we're going to see that now the people that are entering the workforce aren't just men. In fact, we see women, we see children that are working in these industrial factories as well, getting paid less than men. So maybe a continuity you could always talk about during the Industrial Revolution is still we have strong patriarchy, and they pay women and children way less than they do for men working at these factories, even if they're doing similar jobs. So social changes, changes to the family unit, changes to how people are living. It is a really big difference and big change, as I've said. That's the word of the video, just so you guys know. Key concept 5.2 then. This is going to be talking about imperialism, which we kind of brought up already, and the idea of nation-state formation. And so if you just kind of glance around this map, maybe even pause the video, you can see who has power where throughout this time. Now this is the 1700s. We see that we don't have an independent United States yet, but we know that's coming. But we see that the British Empire is in a lot of different places. We see they're in South Africa, we see they're in India, Australia, New Zealand, are just some of the areas that we see for the British Empire. We know the Spanish Empire they're going to have in this time period. We're going to see a lot of those revolutions that are going to happen. But otherwise, as we go through this period, we're going to look at imperialism. And I like this definition of it. Imperialism is the act of extending the rule or authority over foreign nations. Now, sometimes this is direct rule, like colonization. They take over an area, they colonize it, people move there. And sometimes it's more indirect. And they influence the governments that exist there. I like to think of this kind of the next two together through trade as well as another way that they can impact or extend their rule or authority over. And so we see some economic dominance, like for example in India. Before the British government really took control and then ended the Mughal Empire, we see that they really had indirect rule and kind of economic dominance with the British East India Company. And so they are really influencing, but they're working alongside of the government that exists there. It's still imperialistic, but it's not direct rule like colonization. Until something like the Sepoy Mutiny happens, and then we see them that they do take control. But for example, that's what key concept 5.2 is. Now we also know during this period of time we're going to have the scramble for Africa. The scramble for Africa is going to be driven by imperialism. And you have to link us back to the first key concept of this period of the Industrial Revolution. Now that there's industrialization, they need to be able to have these goods, and so they're using Africa for their natural resources. And essentially they come along and they claim land that isn't theirs. And we see some of the major players here. In the blue we see the French. In red we see kind of the big player being the British. And then we see some Germans, Portuguese, Italians, and a little bit of the Spanish there. So for the most part, we see really a strong presence by the British and the French. But all of Europe is involved, all dating back to the Berlin Conference of 1885, as this goes into 1914, before World War I. And we'll talk about decolonization later. Now, some of the motivations for this, besides money, which is a big one, we see some other things emerge. One, we see the poem, The White Man's Burden, this idea that it is the job of Europeans to go in and civilize and Christianize Africa. And we also see this kind of combined with social Darwinism. Basically, they're applying the biological concepts of natural selection to being a more sociological idea, and how essentially there's natural selection and there's better groups in the world than others. And both very terrible things and inaccurate, but we see this is how we have Europeans that essentially dominate the planet at this time through their imperialistic adventures. 5.3 then is kind of taking a different turn. 5.3 is about nationalism, revolution, and reform. Like I said, key word of this period is revolution. 5.1 is about the Industrial Revolution, but 5.3 is about revolutions that happen. And so we're going to talk about in just a second which ones those are. But behind this, we want to think of the key Enlightenment thinkers that have been around during this period that are starting to influence kind of the intellectuals. So we have people like John Locke, the idea of really ideas of natural rights. Also kind of piggybacks off the ideas of Rousseau and the social contract. Montesquieu, the separation of powers, which goes directly against and challenging absolute monarchies that we see during this time. Voltaire, really proponent of free speech, which again, absolute monarchies do not like. All these ideas really challenged a few key things during this period. Ideas of absolute monarchies, like we're going to see in France, and a lot of other areas around Great Britain and Europe, huge deal. Slavery and the idea this is a time period where they challenge these things and we actually get to the point where we abolish slavery and at least more specifically abolish the slave trade that had been coming since period 4. The idea of serfdom, the idea of suffrage and voting rights. So these Enlightenment thinkers are highly key to what's going on. And so the 4 kind of key areas of revolution is the American Revolution, which happens first, the French Revolution, Haitian Revolution, and Latin American Revolution. And as we look at the next slide, you're going to see a chart that you can just pause the video for. This chart goes over the major causes, people, events, outcomes, and differences. Just a few years ago, they did a compare-contrast essay on the AP test looking at these different revolutions. So causes and effects are huge to look at as we look at them. So pause the video, look at this, because you want to look at what caused the American Revolution and who are the key people, like King George III. Otherwise, looking at what happened in Haiti and how Toussaint Louverture, and we're looking at Napoleon Bonaparte, all those things play together. So make sure that you just pause the video and kind of go through at this point these different revolutions, who the key players are, and then ultimately the key differences. We know that the American revolutions obviously found their freedom from the British. The French kind of met in a huge circle and went from an absolute monarchy all the way back to kind of a monarchy, and then had another kind of revolution along the way, and then we have the move Les Mis. And so when you're looking here, we see a lot of the different things that change. Ultimately, though, they do get a constitutional monarchy, but they went through stages of republic that didn't even have a monarchy at all, and we know with the Reign of Terror and all the things that happened during the French Revolution. Haitian Revolution led very differently from the others. We see that they may have been influenced by the Enlightenment, but ultimately we see that it's really around the issue of slavery and rights. And once things happen back in France during their revolution, it impacts the colony of Haiti. And we see that Toussaint Louverture leads an uprising of slaves. And so we have a lot of tension between the social groups, which we also see during the 3 estates in the French Revolution. So all of these are key as we are looking at revolutions. So pause the video, look at those things as we go on. Another key idea during this period is the idea of nationalism, which by definition is the communal identity of a people group, often tied to the idea of how they want a nation or an independent country for themselves. And so we start seeing the early stages of anti-colonial movements, starting with the Sepoy Mutiny, which goes to this idea of how many sepoys, people who were Indian, were working for the British as soldiers, and ultimately there's kind of some rumors about the cartridges and their guns being greased by pig and cow fat, which was offensive to both Muslims and Hindu Indians. And so we see that this brings about a big uprising that then the British kind of suppress massively, which brings a lot of tension, brings the British to have more direct control over India. But as we get into the next period, period 6, we're going to see decolonization efforts all tied back to this idea of nationalism, this pride, this identity as a nation. We also see in China with the Boxer Rebellion, this idea of who are we, and we don't want these foreigners in our lands. And so we're going to start seeing how we have movements to end imperialism during this period of time that will really come to fruition in the next period. And the final key concept, we're almost there, is the 4th one for period 5, which is global migration. And essentially people are moving to different parts of the world. And why is that? What are the causes and effects? Again, this could be a essay or LEQ option when we're looking at cause or effects, or even in the SAQ. So causes of migration. One, search for work. When we're thinking of the context of the Industrial Revolution, we see new technology and modes of transportation makes travel much easier. We also see during this period of time still some coerced or semi-coerced. So we still see some labor migrations, not to the extent that we saw with the transatlantic slave trade, but we still see slaveries around, and we still see Chinese and Indian indentured servitude, which is a thing. We also see convict labor really become a reason why it's pretty much a forced migration of different sorts. We also have seasonal migrants, where people will come to an area, work for a season or temporarily, and then move back. And we're going to see this in the Pacific a lot, as well as people that are moving to the United States to work for a period of time. We see many people from East Asia go to the United States. Now, there are different effects of these migrations that you'll want to know about. One, we're going to see that most of this time period, it is mostly males that are traveling for work. And so that changes some family dynamics when the man of the family is out of the family to work, and then maybe either sending money back or coming back seasonally, or just what that does to kind of families. We're also going to see that in cities, we're going to have ethnic enclaves, or like neighborhoods essentially, where people are going to live together in this new land. If you're from the United States, we know that this is very true. If you go to some urban areas where there's maybe a Chinatown, where a lot of people who are Chinese live in the same area. We're going to see that with areas of Koreans in the same area, and on with lots of different ethnicities. And so this is one of the effects that happens. It also creates some serious ethnic and racial tensions and discrimination. We know that in a period in U.S. history, they are not going to allow people from China and East Asia to really move to the United States to work. So they have the Chinese Exclusion Acts and really limit which immigrants are coming into the United States. But the reality is people are moving around the world, and people are going to be moving even more in period 6 as we get there. But you're almost there. We're almost done reviewing. You got through period 5. Good luck, and hopefully that brings everything together, from the Industrial Revolution to the idea of imperialism to individual revolutions from different countries, and then global migrations. Period 5.